welcome on behalf of the Water Efficiency Action Network of the Colorado River Basin. Thanks for joining us. This is an exciting topic. It's a great set of panelists, and it's pretty much a full house on the line. Our topic today, how does water efficiency in all its forms figure into future plans for the Colorado River Basin, specifically in the wake of the recent Reclamation study on Colorado River Basin options. Next. I'm Cindy Dyballa, and I'm serving as coordinator for the new network as part of my consulting practice to nonprofit groups. I'm going to moderate this webinar, and before I introduce, what you can see is just a distinguished group. I'd like to say a few words about the network and also about how the webinar is going to work. As I said, the webinar is organized by the steering committee of the Water Efficiency Action Network. This is a new multi-stakeholder organization in the Colorado River Basin. Next. And it's formed because we all know there's lots of conflicts in this river basin. But one thing we can all find common ground on is using wisely what we do have. All Colorado Basin water users and uses are interdependent, and we all benefit by ensuring that sufficient water for all of these uses we find important is available to us. The mission of the organization is to collaborate in advancing water efficiency in the Colorado River Basin. And we need it quite seriously, collaboration, information, and exchange amongst different parties with varying perspectives. Next, please. So members are welcome from all interested groups. The steering committee that organized this first event includes a variety of perspectives, local government, water provider, nonprofit, and research perspectives. And you can join the network now if you'd like, getting the first 6 months of a fairly minimal membership for the year free. And you can have more. You can find more information at the website at www.wien-crb.org. To start, we hope that members will be able to enjoy other webinars such as this. And there's an annual meeting and educational program planned for October at the Water Smart Innovations workshop, conference, in October. We hope that work groups will form on topics of interest to the group. We hope to fill in the gaps and not to replicate what's going on in many other arenas in the Colorado Basin and in water efficiency generally. So next, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Carly Jerla is the first speaker. She will give an overview of water efficiency in the strategies of the Reclamation Basin study. She's the co-project manager, as many of you know, and we look forward to hearing what she has to say. Before she starts, I want to briefly review who else will be speaking. Brad Udall from the University of Colorado on climate change and water efficiency. Drew Beckwith from Western Resource Advocates on the role of conservation in meeting future water needs. Eric Kuhn from the Colorado River Water District. I think I had too many waters in there. Covering risk management, conservation, and an upper basin perspective on the basin study. And last, Bill Hasencamp from Metropolitan Water District, a municipal water provider's perspective on water efficiency in the basin study. This is just a fabulous lineup. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes. We would like to take questions and comments by the chat box on the side of your screen. If it's an informational, a factual question, I will try to ask it at the time, but we'll try to mostly save questions for the end. So simply type them in the box, and we'll read them out as we get them. So next, please. So Carly, would you like to take it from here?
Great, sure. Thanks, Cindy. So as Cindy said, my name is Carly Jerla, and I was the study manager for the Colorado River Basin Water Supply and Demand Study from the Bureau of Reclamation. I'd also like to recognize my counterpart from the Basin State side, as this study was cost-shared with the 7 Colorado River Basin states, and that is Kay Brothers of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. And the purpose of my talk today is to provide you all a brief overview of how conservation, both municipal and industrial and agricultural, were handled in the study. Next slide, please. I know most listening are fairly familiar, but just in case you're not, I want to take a minute to briefly tell you what the study is and is not. The study was a 3-year effort. It began in January of 2010 and it ended in December 2012, so just about a month ago. And it was cost shared by the Bureau of Reclamation and the 7 Colorado River Basin states. It was also conducted in collaboration with stakeholders throughout the basin, various Native American tribes and communities, conservation organizations were involved in the study, and these collaborations were critical to the study's success. The objectives of the study were broad, and they're spelled out here on the slide. They were to assess future water supply and demand in the Colorado River Basin and in those resulting imbalances over the next 50 years. So we were projecting through 2060. And we also looked at developing and evaluating opportunities or options and strategies to resolve those imbalances. The study took a broad exploratory approach, and it is a planning study. It doesn't result in any decisions. It is not a NEPA document. But what it does do is provide a solid technical foundation for future activities and dialogue. And I want to draw your attention here for a minute to the map on the slide that is showing the study area. This includes not just the hydrologic boundaries of the Colorado River Basin, but the adjacent areas of the basin that receive Colorado River water. As most of you know, much of the water generated in the basin is exported to areas outside of the basin for use. And this is particularly important when thinking about the potential for conservation. Only conservation measures that result in savings and consumptive use, or water consumed, is going to result in water savings for areas that are within that hydrologic basin, because what isn't consumed is eventually returned to the river. On the other hand, conservation measures that result in less water being diverted out of the basin to those adjacent areas will result in water savings. So that's just kind of an important background piece to keep in mind when thinking about applying conservation throughout the Colorado River Basin and those adjacent areas that receive Colorado River water. Next slide, please. So in developing options and strategies to resolve future supply and demand imbalances, which was one of the key objectives of the study, the public was asked to submit ideas over a 3-month period in late 2011, early 2012, as the goal was to collect a broad range of ideas, recognizing that there really is no silver bullet to dealing with the projected imbalances on the basin. And during that time, over 150 options were submitted to the study. All of these options were included and are reflected in the study in some manner. I want to note that all are available in their original format as received, and that is going to be in the study's technical report F, as in Frank. Of the options received, and the pie chart here shows the distribution of the major categories of the options received, about 35% were with respect to conservation to reduce demand for Colorado River water. About 29 were about municipal and industrial conservation, and 9 were regarding agricultural conservation. There were also a few about energy water use efficiency that we put into this category as well. Not all options received were independently analyzed, and in many cases did not lend themselves to our modeling and portfolio process. And so a process was developed where what we call representative options were developed from what was submitted, with the idea of capturing the concepts of what were submitted. And I'll describe to you a little bit later, the resulting representative options for the M&I and ag conservation options submitted. Part of that process included developing letter ratings or scores, A through E, A being favorable, E being not favorable, for a set of 17 criteria that describe different aspects of the options, so things like cost, timing, yields, permitting, operational flexibility, things like that. And this step was important in determining which options became part of the study portfolios or packages of options that represent a strategy for future management. And these ratings provided a basis for filtering out several options and also expressing preferences towards other options. Next slide, please. So we'll go through this slide fairly quickly, but I just wanted to show some examples of what was submitted that comprise this reduced demand category for conservation. So for M&I conservation, it was fairly broad. Here's a list of the different types of things that came in. Similarly, for ag conservation, most things fit into these general categories. Some options were exclusively what's listed here. And again, that technical report F will kind of show you exactly what was submitted and how those were worked into representative options. Next slide, please. So I want to quickly change gears just a minute to talk about the study's demand scenarios because conservation also had a role in future demand, obviously, and is not just a piece of the options and strategies process of the study. So as you know, a scenario planning process was utilized in the study to develop a range of future projections for Colorado River demand. This figure is showing you the 6 scenarios that were developed and quantified in the study. It's also being shown in addition to what historical use has been on the basin. So we're showing that 1970 to about 2010, and then picking up in about 2012 is the cone of our future projected scenarios. As part of developing these scenarios, key driving forces were identified that affect these future demands, and these driving forces were quantified, and these are things like irrigated acreage or population, and future changes in water use efficiency was identified as one of these key driving forces. And all of the demand scenarios contain to some degree a level of ag and M&I conservation. And it's important to note that the representative options were developed to reflect conservation above and beyond what's already included in the demand scenarios or in the various states' water plans. And so just to give you an idea of what's already included in there, for M&I conservation, changes in per capita water usage in the scenarios ranges from about 7 to 20% decline. So there's a level of conservation already built into these scenarios. Next slide, please.
This is Cindy. That's 7 to 20% built into all the scenarios.
The amount of M&I conservation built into each scenario ranges between 7 to 20%.
Thank you.
Sure. Switching back again to how the representative options for M&I conservation was developed. 3 representative options were developed from the submitted options. Each representative option reflects different degrees of additional M&I conservation above, again, what was included in the demand scenarios. And it was assumed that the additional conservation would be implemented at a study area level through state or federally incentivized programs. So we weren't identifying particularly who would pay for this additional conservation. And these would be through progressively ambitious water conservation, best management practices, and adoption rates. and we looked at certain areas of conservation measures and made assumptions about which best management practices would go into these areas and what adoption rates would be assumed for these areas. And those areas were things like residential indoor, commercial, institutional, and industrial, outdoor landscaping, and water losses, so losses occurring in water utilities distribution systems. These approaches were derived from state of Colorado and California approaches. Those were used to help identify these best management practices and adoption rates. And these were applied to all of those areas, these were applied to those areas that have significant M&I use throughout the study area to come up with reductions in demands that would go under each scenario. And these results are shown in the table on this slide. You can see that the amount of conservation estimated to be in each of the demand scenarios, and also the level of additional conservation assumed through 2060. The additional amount ranges from about 650,000 acre-feet to 1.25 million acre-feet, depending on which demand scenario you're in. An important point and limitation to note regarding the potential that is assumed for each conservation measure is that we did not disaggregate this to specific locations throughout the study area. A basin-wide approach was taken, and the real potential for conservation may be much more or less in specific areas throughout the study area, given the conservation plans that are already in place, and thus basin-wide potential may change. So I think it's important to note that in the amount of conservation, both for M&I and ag, that was explored in the study isn't necessarily saying that is the only, that is the hard level of conservation that is attainable. It's a broad basin-wide number that's driven by a set of assumptions, and certainly next steps as we look forward need to look into those assumptions in much more detail. Next slide, please. So this figure is showing you those ratings, those A through E ratings. A is good, E is bad, generally, for each of the 17 criteria that was assessed in the study. And in addition, the estimated costs for M&I conservation for each 200,000 acre-foot increment. As you can see, conservation is an extremely favorable option. There is some implementation risk that is incurred at the higher levels. Green, if you see a lot of green, that's indicating that the ratings were fairly favorable. We get towards red as we get least favorable. To summarize the costs, we estimated them to range from about $500 per acre foot to $900 per acre foot, depending on which level of conservation, and then category-specific costs. So, for those residential indoor, outdoor landscape, for example, have a little bit of a wider range, $350 to $1,400 an acre foot. And again, these costs were generated based on an approach used by the state of California. Next slide, please. So I'm going to shift gears now to agricultural conservation. Two representative options were developed reflecting two different implementation approaches. Again, these were at a basin-wide level. The two different implementation approaches are basin-wide agricultural conservation through incentive-based programs, and then basin-wide agricultural conservation with transfers. And each approach is a blend of the different conservation measures listed in the table below. Largely the differences in the two approaches is that conservation through incentive-based programs is assumed to be more heavily weighted in the beginning towards on-farm measures, so deficit irrigation, advanced irrigation scheduling, things like that, with some portions of system improvement and fallowing coming on in the higher levels, whereas with conservation with transfers, that approach, it's assumed to be more heavily weighted in the beginning towards fallowing, and then system improvements and on-farm coming on in the subsequent steps. This table is showing you the importance of considering the impacts of return flows, which I believe Eric will speak to a little bit later when assessing agricultural conservation potential. The total estimated water savings is much less when you're looking at consumptive use versus a reduction in total diversion. Because these measures could produce different amount of savings depending on locations in the basin, the combinations of measure used, the total quantity was estimated as an aggregate for each approach rather than a summation of the individual measures. So like M&I conservation, the study looked at about 1 million acre-feet of agricultural conservation. Next slide, please. So again, we have the same figure we saw with M&I conservation, but for ag, there are 10 increments of 200,000 acre-feet up to about 1 million with and without transfers. You can see that there are some trade-offs here between an incentivized program or using transfers, determined to be in the policy or socioeconomic and the implementation risk, long-term viability criterions. These trade-offs aside, ag conservation is a favorable option in terms of most criteria and cost. The cost ranges from about $150 to $750 depending on the level, and the study did not quantify cost differences between the different approaches. Next slide, please. So the study evaluated the effectiveness of options at resolving imbalances by packaging them into portfolios that were designed to express different strategies towards resolving future imbalances. The favorability of M&I conservation, as depicted in the earlier figures, meant that it was a component of all 4 portfolios. Ag conservation with transfers was also a component of all of the portfolios. Portfolios were modeled dynamically, meaning the options were only implemented as they were needed to deal with vulnerable system conditions. And what we found through that process is that M&I conservation was frequently implemented with a short delay from its first availability date under a wide range of future conditions. This was also true for the lower levels of ag conservation with transfers. For the higher level of the ag conservation with transfers, what we found is that this was implemented frequently with a short delay, but really only under those future conditions with particularly low hydrology. And that reflects some of those trade-offs illustrated in the previous figures. Next slide, please. So what's next? First off, conservation in both sectors is an area that municipalities and agricultural entities have been and will continue to pursue. I think the study results really confirm what we already knew. There are important local differences in conservation potential and cost the study didn't deal with that we need to further explore. And as spelled out in the next step section of the study report, later this year work groups will be established. These will be convened by Reclamation and include the basin states in addition to participation from other interested stakeholders. And these groups will further explore conservation opportunities and identify the process for moving forward on these next steps. Next slide, please. And I just want to conclude by thanking you for your time and your interest. There is some contact information for the study. The study website is listed here. Also, the study email. We are scheduling a public webinar on the final study findings for later this month. And if you would like to be notified of when that is, go ahead and send an email to the email address listed here saying add me to your list, and you will get an email and can join us for that final study webinar. And thanks again, and I guess I'm going to pass it back to Cindy.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. That's great. Next. So that was just fabulous. It answered some of my questions about how water efficiency fits in. It also raised a bunch of questions, and I bet I'm not the only one. There's not any factual questions at the moment, so we'll go on to Brad Udall, University of Colorado, and NOAA Western Water Assessment, who will continue our perspective of the basin as we work from the basin down to perspectives that are more localized. Brad, would you like to start? Thank you.
Certainly, Cindy. Thank you. Good afternoon from Boulder, Colorado. I'm Brad Udall, and I run the University of Colorado NOAA Western Water Assessment, and I will soon be based at the University of Colorado Law School. The Colorado River Basin is arguably the most studied river in the world with respect to climate change, and I've certainly done my part of this over the last 10 years. This first graph here shows 112 different future projections from 2011 out to 2061 there on the horizontal axis, and annual volumes on the vertical axis for the Lee Ferry Point on the Colorado River. And this is the point, the dividing line between the upper basin and the lower basin, and it's about where 90% of the flow above originates. There are a few lines here I want to point out. There is a thin line, horizontal line at 15,000 or 15 million acre feet, the long-term annual flow of the river at Lee's Ferry during the historic period. And then there is a dark line here, dark bold line, and there's a little point at it at the end. The right-hand side says minus 9%. That is a median result out of these 112 different climate projections. The projections were taken from the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, fourth assessment model set, also known as the CMIP-3 models. And that 9% median decline is the figure you commonly hear associated with what the future of the Colorado River might be at the midpoint of this coming century. This graph also shows, however, all the different other runs, and you can see them both in terms of the little whiskers, and you see, for example, a 5 million acre foot low flow, almost consistent throughout those years, and maximum flows of almost 45 million acre feet, with the observed max there at about 25 million. There's another point on this graph I want to show you, which is right where the 15 million acre foot line, horizontal line, runs off the edge there at the right. And it's at the very top of the shading, which indicates that 75% of the runs at 2061 come in below the long-term average of 15 million acre foot. And that's a consistent finding, and I'm going to talk about it in the next slide, please, that shows what it looks like using the next set of model runs that the IPCC has generated, the so-called CMIP-5. And this is a study that Richard Seeger, who's done previous studies in the Colorado River Basin, including one that appeared in Science, entitled something like Model Projections of an Imminent Transition to a More Arid Climate in the Southwest. I think that appeared in about 2007. And this is a redo of that study, which used the old models. And so this study now uses the newer models. And effectively the same thing shows up. In the image there on the left, under the ANN, or annual, you can see about a 10% median and average decline in the river system at mid-century. And the other portions, the other little box and whiskers on there show you the different seasons, JFM being January, February, March. On the right side of this image are the individual model runs. And the red dots, or black dots in the case of multiple ensemble members for the same model, show that roughly 15 or 14 out of those 16 models lie on the decline side, that is to the left of that little blue arrow at the bottom of the diagram. And so the CMIP-5 model runs are showing us almost exactly the same thing that we've learned from the future, which is the risk in the Colorado River is on the downward side of flows. Some of these models do produce more, but for the most part, almost all of them show declines. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk about what we know about demand. Demand actually has been studied much, much less in the river system, and I would argue throughout the climate change scientific world. It's a harder number to come by. It involves lots more variables. It's harder to do. And the River Basin study, to its credit, looked at how demand might change, not just in terms of growth of demands, but how climate change through reductions in precipitation and increases in temperature would modify the demands that exist at any given year. And so this graph, which on the bottom has years, and on the right-hand or left-hand side, the vertical axis there shows demand amounts. There are two lines here. The black line, which is a demand projection without climate change, and the red line there is that same demand projection using climate change factors applied to the growth. And you can see there's roughly a 4% difference out at the end of the study period. And all those other traces show different kinds of future demands, how they might vary under different climate change scenarios. So not only are we looking at likely a supply decrease, we're looking at a demand increase. And the whole ramifications of this are now talked about in my final slide, which talks about which talks in some editorial context here. The Department of Interior Secretary Salazar and the Commissioner of Reclamation, Mike Connor, gave a press conference when the Basin study was released. And they talked about just how limited the supply options were. And I would argue this is a transition for reclamation, and it's an important transition. It's a new era. I have had the privilege to work in Australia over the last 4 years. I've spent 6 months down there, and down under they have redone their water system to think about optimizing 3 outcomes. How do you take a scarce resource, water, and optimize economic, social, and environmental needs? And that's exactly the thinking I think we need to do in this basin. One of the games that almost everyone in the water business has played historically in the Colorado River Basin and arguably throughout the country is that we're running out of water. Everyone likes to play this game. The press never fails to run a good running out of water story. The water providers like to play it in subtle ways. Scientists, including myself, have played this game, in large part aided and abetted by the press, and the NGOs have also played it as well. And the result of this game, I think, is a pernicious outcome. And if you look up pernicious in the dictionary, it says having a harmful effect in a gradual or subtle way. And in particular, the outcome is to automatically look at increasing supplies as the only way to solve these kinds of problems. Well, if you're truly out of water, then that's the only option you have. But if you have reduced supplies, you actually have lots of other options besides automatically thinking the only fix is to increase supplies. And so with climate change, if you take the 9% median decline in supplies and the 4% increase in demands, and you roughly end up with about 85% of your current supplies. And that number is still a very large number in the Colorado River Basin. It's almost 13 million acre-feet. It creates lots of political problems. It creates problems with the law of the river in some cases. But we are now thinking that those problems are actually potentially easier to solve than the supply side issues. And to get to solutions, looking at the Australians and elsewhere, risk management, economics, and values, I think all are going to provide some guide to how we solve this. And when you look at what Carly showed, and I think what you're going to see through the rest of this presentation, that water efficiency, conservation, reuse are very safe bets. They're in fact the safest bets we have. They're the cheapest and they're the least environmentally harmful. And conversely, new supplies based on unknown hydrology with climate change a joker in the deck, those new supplies are in fact the riskiest bet in terms of yield, in terms of cost, and in terms of environmental harm. And with that, I'll end my presentation.
Well, thanks. That sure gives us something to think about. We did have one technical question that came in for Carly while Brad was talking. It came in to me. I will ask her that, and it looks like there is one technical question for Brad. So, Carly, going back to your cost figures for acre-feet of savings from water conservation, are these figures meant to quantify the cost of each individual acre-foot of savings or the cost of a recurring acre-foot of savings? In other words, does this acre-foot repeat, or did you get it down to just one time only?
Yep. So the cost numbers are a per unit cost, so they're for each individual acre-foot of savings. It's important to note, though, that M&I conservation was, the representative option was built by assuming essentially a 3-level program that would need to go into place with increasing levels as you reach the higher levels, with increasing costs as you reach the higher levels of that program. So when we're looking at, say, $900 per acre foot for the final 200,000 acre feet, that's not $900 per acre foot for all of the 1 million savings that you've accrued up to that point. It's really for that final step of the program. But it is a unit cost per each individual acre feet of savings.
So in addition to what you have achieved in the first 2 levels, that 3rd level is another set of costs.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Before we continue, Brad, what are the elements of the 4% demand increase that is modeled in the climate change scenarios you showed? Is it higher evapotranspiration for crops and landscapes, and or greater evaporative consumption from higher air conditioning and power generation because it's warmer, or other things? So what are the elements?
I would let Carly answer that question as manager of the study.
Okay.
Sure, I can take that one. That number is derived from looking at the effects of increasing temperature, so affecting increasing evapotranspiration on agriculture, outdoor M&I uses, and also reservoir evaporation.
Did you go to the, okay, great. So let's have the next slide and go on here as we work our way from the entire basin to an upper basin perspective. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce Eric, no, excuse me, still on the upper basin, Drew Beckwith, Western Resources Associates, Advocates, who will talk from a basin-wide perspective about the role of conservation in meeting our future needs as presented in the Basin study, and do that from a nonprofit point of view.
Yeah.
Thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Cindy. Pleasure to be on the webinar today. The first slide here that I wanted to show is really an effort to celebrate the success that we've had with conservation over the past 2 decades in the Colorado River Basin and users of Colorado River Basin water. So for those of you that haven't read this report down there at the bottom, this is Mike Cohen from the Pacific Institute, his report, Municipal Deliveries of Colorado River Basin Water. I would sort of consider it a must-read. What you're seeing on the graph are 2 sets of bars. You've got the darker ones from 1990 per capita water use. You've got the lighter blue ones from 2008. So over the course of 20 years, you see this shift in the median GPCD. It goes down by about 20%. So said another way, users of Colorado River water have reduced their use by about 1% per year in per capita declines over the past 2 decades. And let's go next slide. That's because of things like plumbing codes, changing social preferences, customer programs that water utilities are operating, and also because of cost. This is, again, another wonderful graph from Janice Beecher at Michigan State University. She tracks the basically sort of a cost index for various utilities. And you see the blue line cruising off the top right-hand corner of this graph is the water and sewer prices. This is water and sewer costs have basically doubled the sort of consumer price index over the past 30 years, and there's really no end in sight, I think, for the increasing cost of water in the U.S. This is due to a number of things, primarily infrastructure issues. Our water system is getting old, and we've got to replace the pipes that are already in the ground. We've got increasing water quality regulations from the federal government, and we've got decreasing funding from the federal government as well. And so I'd argue, next slide, that our declines in per capita use are going to continue into the future. And I would argue that some of the quantity for municipal savings in the Basin study was in fact underestimated. And I'm happy to hear Carly say that Reclamation is certainly going to be looking into assumptions on how the quantity was determined. And so what you see here is basically 5 lines. The bottom one is the conservation savings that are embedded already in the demand scenario. So this happens to be the current projected scenario. It's around 500,000 acre-feet. And then, as Carly mentioned, we have this incremental steps of the conservation option, level 1, level 2, level 3. So the blue line there is about 1 million acre-feet of savings in a conservation option, plus about 500,000 acre-feet of savings from already embedded in the demand. And what I have overlaid on top of it is basically what's been happening for the past 20 years. So the black line is 1% per year. And if we merely project that into the future for the next 50 years, you see something that is above and beyond even the highest level projected by the study. And one thing that's important to know about these options and strategies is sort of the political climate in which they were, I guess I would say, characterized. And there's some wonderful language in the Basin study that basically says there's a degree of urgency in the Basin, that there is positive political alignment, that there is persistent and consistent pursuit of these options and strategies because everyone recognizes the Basin is having some challenges with its water supply. And so I would posit that if all of those things are happening, we certainly should be able to maintain the savings that we already have been achieving for the past 20 years, and we should probably be even able to achieve more. So let's go next slide. I think that Brad covered this nicely, and I will just hit on some of the fundamental reasons that conservation has to be one of the top priorities in the Basin. Efficiency is cheap. Carly mentioned the different portfolios of options that were put together. Portfolio D is the ones that are common to all the portfolios. You see ag conservation and M&I conservation there coming in at $500 an acre foot or less on the average. Portfolio C is a portfolio that was primarily posited by the NGO community, modern management techniques that we think are dealing more with on the demand side, dust on snow mitigation, tamarisk removal, and then portfolio B, perhaps the more classic approach of let's just build more water supplies. And so the point of my chart here is just to show that demand management related options are 3 to 4 times cheaper than traditional augmentation supply approaches. Next slide, please. So not only is efficiency cheap, it's also fast. We can literally implement efficiency within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. You can write a conservation plan, a program, you can implement it, and you can totally change it in a year. This is not true of large infrastructure projects that may have to go through NEPA processes, et cetera. Next slide, please. Other successes. Carly listed a bunch of these types of efficiency options that are in place already that we could seek to expand upon. I just bolded 2 of these because I think they're going to be a very important part of where efficiency moves in the future. One of them being land use simply because it's much faster and easier to build a home or a community that's water smart from the start than it is to try to retrofit it once it's been built. And I think public norming and the more social side of conservation behavior is a burgeoning field that needs to be explored a little bit more. Next slide, please. And so I think I'll just sort of wrap up with mentioning that the Colorado Basin and its economies are really depending significantly more on recreation and tourism than they have in the past. And this is really an amenity-based an economy. And so the fact that these conservation measures show up well, they improve performance in some of the environmental metrics that are present in the Basin study, I think speaks to the importance of these types of options for the Basin's continued economic prosperity. Efficiency programs are something that customers want. I mean, this is ultimately, if you ask a customer if they want, a water provider to pay them $50 to change a toilet, they say yes, of course. Help me do these things. I want it. This quote here from Doug Kenny, I like to throw out there. I don't even know if he knows that I do it, but I think it fundamentally says what Brad sort of said as well. Like we have no idea about if it's going to rain or not tomorrow. What we really can control is whether or not we water the grass. And I think that the modern management of the Colorado River Basin is going to depend much more on psychologists and social scientists and people that understand human behavior and the brain rather than the traditional engineering approach that has pervaded for the past couple hundred years. So, and just in closing, I am in no way suggesting that efficiency efforts to this level that I'm suggesting are going to be easy. It will certainly take concerted efforts. There will not need to be much more integration of people involved. The science is rapidly evolving, but I surely believe that successes will be continue to be achieved. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks a lot. That was great. We have a bunch of questions. I'm going to try to just do one which looks mostly factual right now. And I think this is for Carly. How were weather modification savings calculated? Are there any published studies on the impact of weather modification? You want to take now or later?
How about I take that one at the end?
Okay, and then we have a couple of others that I think work better at the end. But thank you so much, people, for getting them in here because we got plenty to talk about. I'd like to make sure that Eric Kuhn, the director of the Colorado Water Conservation District at the headwaters of the Colorado River, gets a chance to talk both about risk management and conservation in the basin. Next slide, please. And also the perspective from upstream. Eric?
Yeah, well, thank you. My name is Eric Kuhn. I'm the general manager of the Colorado River Water Conservation District. I only included this slide, which is normally a cover slide, because this satellite view of the basin here, you can see in blue where the district is. The upper basin is about 110,000 square miles. The district I work for is about 30,000 of that, but of that 15 million historic number for natural flow at Lee Ferry, about 60% of that originates within our district because that's we have very many mountains. Next slide, please. And what I want to mention is go back to Carly's slide. Conservation in the upper basin and in the different parts of the basin, whether you're an exporter or within the basin, are very different. And her slide, it talked about on-farm improvements, and if you looked at the increase in consumptive use, it was 0. What does that mean? And then just think about that. But the basin study results from an upper basin perspective there were some interesting things in there. If you use the climate change hydrology, more than 1 in 5 climate change traces post-2040 showed some kind of Lee Ferry deficit. If you use a weighted average of all of the traces for 4 different methodologies or hydrology methodologies, it's about 1 in 12 or 8%. You got to understand what's going on there, but conservation in the upper basin with a water bank is an effective strategy at dealing with this so-called Lee Ferry deficit. Next slide, please. And why is a Lee Ferry deficit important? Well, under the Colorado River Compact, the 4 upper division states, collective that make up, with a little bit of Arizona, the upper basin, have an obligation to not deplete the flows at Lee Ferry below 75 million over any 10 consecutive years. They also have an currently undefined obligation to half of the Mexican treaty's deficiency that's not provided by the surplus. The Basin study, for political reasons, couldn't really address that issue because nobody agrees on what that is. So unless they wanted to have a 50-year pause to address that question, the Basin study had to assume, the only thing that it could assume was 75 over 10. But if the upper basin states, if you want to call it, have a deficit at Lee Ferry, that could lead to a legal curtailment of water rights under the 1922 and 1948 compacts. Next slide, please. A legal curtailment is something that would be very, very serious. In other words, towns like Denver, which have 60% of their water supply in years like this come from the Colorado River, might not have any. So power plants, no water. But for the most part, most of our agricultural rights in the upper basin came around before 1922. And there's another provision in the compact that basically said present perfected rights, those rights that were in existence at the time the compact was negotiated and put in place, ratified, are unimpaired by this compact. What the upper division believes, and there's plenty of reason to believe this is correct based on minutes, is those rights that were in place in diverting water before the compact came along cannot be curtailed in order to meet that 75 million over 10-year period. There may be some differences of opinion on that, but of course on anything, but that's the general assumption that we make. So the bottom line is a curtailment. If you had a deficit and that deficit became a curtailment, that's a serious situation with economic consequences, with environmental consequences, with potentially even human health consequences, and it's something we want to avoid it. So how would we avoid it? Well, next slide, please. Conservation is the key. But if it's conservation, it has to address consumptive use. Putting all of the low flush toilets, filling, 1 gallon per flush toilets in every upper basin home would not change the Lee Ferry flow at all. What we have to do, and I'll get right to this, is manage grass. In western Colorado, 90% of our agricultural consumptive use is for hay, pasture grasses, and alfalfa. About 10% is for traditional row crops. 90+% of our municipal consumptive use is for outdoor use. It's for lawns and parks, okay, things that evaporate water. So if we're going to avoid a curtailment, what we're going to have to do in Colorado, in the upper basin, not just western Colorado, is we're going to have to do things that were on Carly's chart: deficit irrigation, fallowing. But with 90% of the agriculture, at least in Colorado, and probably more in the other 3 upper division states, it's really not easy to fallow. We've got to look at things like deficit irrigation, which means paying a rancher to get 2 crops of hay instead of 4. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. And how would we implement that? Next slide, please. What we would do is we would look at these signposts, okay, and things like triggers. I call them triggers. Let's say Lake Powell storage goes below some level. Let me just say 10 million acre feet. At that point in time, we'd have to have in place, and this is like a water bank, a system where certain uses would voluntarily or for money, they would curtail their voluntarily reduce their consumptive use, and that water would then go into Lake Powell, and it would be available as system water. If we got down to 7 million, maybe we'd have to have more consumptive uses. Maybe we go in from 100,000 acres under deficit irrigation to 200,000. And that's the concept of how in the upper basin, as flows drop off, and this is, Brad said the same thing, it's all about demand management. It's all about managing consumptive use. And the real question is, the questions are really, how is this going to happen within the framework of water rights, within the framework in the upper basin of 4 different states with different really administrative systems and different cultures and different politics? And what's the incentive to do this? And is it politically feasible? Is it economically feasible? And those are the questions we're going to look at in the many, many years to come. I was very quick on this, but I was very conscious of time. And I will just simply say that of all, and this is just my own opinion, of all of the things that we look at from an upper basin perspective and that were addressed in the study, we know there are things that are going to be very controversial, like pipelines to Kansas City or a pipeline out of out of the Snake River and into Wyoming. Those things are could create a whole bunch of problems, and they're unlikely, in my view, to produce much water. The other ones I think have some scientific issues, like can we really cloud seed our way to 2 million acre, that additional 2 million acre feet in the basin? Don't think so. That's just my view. I may be proven wrong, but I don't think so. The real one that works there in the upper basin is this conservation that's applied to some sort of system analysis. So when there's a need for the water, when reservoirs are low, when we're being threatened by a curtailment or a deficit at leaf area, we do things and we keep increasing those as it gets lower and lower and the risk gets higher. In a nutshell, that's my presentation. I will say there are so many issues on this to resolve, and it's really in its infancy, although we started at the River District studying this concept about 5 years ago. This whole issue of risk management, it's really a paradigm shift in the upper Colorado River Basin. And I think that's it, and I thank everybody for participating, and we've got one more great presentation, and I'll turn it over to the moderator.
Thank you, Eric. That was great. We have some questions about weather modification and a number of other topics that I'd like to save to the end. And I'd like to introduce moving from the upper basin to the lower basin and moving from primarily agricultural to primarily municipal discussion. I'd like to introduce Bill Hasencamp from Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, who will provide one of, I've got to believe, many municipal perspectives on conservation and the basin study. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Cindy. First, a little plug about my district. I'm a small district on the Southern California. We provide water to 26 member agencies, our 26 customers in 6 counties, but we have 19 million residents in our service area. That's about 1 in 17 people in the United States live in our little strip of land between Ventura County and San Diego. Our retail demand is about 4 million acre feet. Metropolitan provides about half of the retail demands with imported supplies and helps partner with our member agencies for local supplies. Next slide, please. Now, before we look to the future, we have to look to the past to see how we got to where we are today. And briefly, the story of California is the story of massive water projects to move water massive distances. In California, most of the water is in the north part of the state, in the Sierra Nevadas, which parts of those areas receive over 100 inches of rain a year, and in the east in the Colorado River. However, the people live on the opposite side of the state in the west and south areas, which has resulted in pipelines and aqueducts moving water hundreds of miles. Initially, there were local projects shown in orange, relatively small projects, McKelvey River Aqueduct, Hetch Hetchy system providing water to the Bay Area, Los Angeles Aqueduct, and our own Colorado River Aqueduct. Then the federal government got involved with bigger projects, Central Valley Project from Shasta Lake down to throughout the Central Valley, and the All-American Canal to Imperial and Coachella Valleys. And finally, the massive State Water Project, largest water delivery system in the country, from the Sacramento River to the Bay Area and Central and Southern California. Well, despite these massive projects and water delivery systems, we had a drought in the 1990s that caused significant rationing throughout the state. And at Metropolitan, that gave us a pause, and we said, moving forward, we're not going to be building massive projects to meet our needs. We're going to develop an integrated resources plan and meet our needs through, next slide, a two-pronged approach. The first is conjunctively use of our imported water supplies. Storing water in wet years when there's extra water in off-stream reservoirs, both in our new Diamond Valley Lake in Southern California and in our groundwater basins, and then using that water in average and dry years, and then in the driest years also do ag-to-urban transfers. So living within the same amount of water we had in the past, but conjunctively using that supply. Next slide. And then meeting growth locally, partnering with our member agencies on water recycling projects, desalination projects, mostly brackish water desalination, groundwater recovery projects, and of course conservation. Next slide. Since the 1990s, through our partnerships with our member agencies, Metropolitan has incentivized conservation. We've used the carrot approach to make conservation and local resources cost effective. And so we've provided $322 million in conservation incentives that have provided 1.7 million acre-feet to date. Water recycling, just over $300 million, 1.8 million acre-feet. Groundwater recovery, $111 million for 600,000 acre-feet. And so far, desalination projects are in the pike, but since we don't provide incentives till the water is produced, we haven't made any incentives because no water is being generated. There's also a couple dots in San Diego County that are not part of our local resources program that are also moving forward, but still no water yet from the ocean has been meet our demands. In addition to these amounts, our member agencies have done their own conservation and projects. This is just our partnership. Next slide. So with that, this shows our per capita use over the last decade or 15 years. And you can see that it's jumped up and down, but it hasn't really dropped that much. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is it's been a pretty hot and dry decade during the 2000s, and also people have been moving to hotter and drier areas of Southern California. Most of our growth has occurred in the inland communities, which use more water. So, so even though we have been aggressively implementing conservation, the per capita use hasn't dropped that much. Until the last couple of years, you'll see significant drops in 2010 and 2011. We don't have 2012 data yet. Partly that's due to, of course, we've had 2011 was wet, and also the economic downturn. But our baseline is the average, weather-adjusted average from the 10 years before 2008. And in California, we have a 20 by 20 rule, which requires urban agencies to reduce their per capita use 20% by the year 2020. And so you can see that's the target out 20 years of a 20% reduction in GPCD. Next slide, please. On top of that, our integrated resources plan looks out to 2035. And by 2035, we have some pretty aggressive goals of our total water use efficiency savings of 2.2 million acre-feet a year. That's both conservation and water recycling projects. And that's going to require a transformation of public's perception, as Drew was talking about, which I think is happening more and more through education and news campaigns and news reports. And we also have a goal of providing an additional 1.9 million acre-feet in local resources annually. That's through groundwater, stormwater capture, and seawater desalination. Next slide. So with that backdrop and with all that we're already doing, how does what we've already done fit into the Basin study? Well, a couple of conclusions that I think you can derive from the Basin study. One is it does highlight, as Drew said earlier, that most areas are aggressively pursuing water use efficiency projects. There has been a reduction basin-wide, and there's plans to keep reducing, like California's 20 by 20 legislation. So we can expect further reductions. However, even with the further reductions, there's a gap in future. And as it was pointed out in the Basin study, more water can be conserved than the current plans. And partly because most agencies don't plan 50 years out for real conservation measures. It's more 20 to 30 year time frame. It's pretty speculative about 50 years. But I think no or little low-hanging fruit is available. And I think a couple of justifications for that. One is the large-scale water recycling analyzed in the Basin study requires massive infrastructure and significant changes to current regulations. Current laws do not allow the type of reuse that are planned in the Basin study, or at least examined in the Basin study. And taking the water from the ocean to where it could be used to meet future demands would require some significant investment. So it's not cheap, and I don't think it's easy. I appreciate what Drew said, is that we've been at 1% per year in the past, so why can't we stay at 1% per year going forward? Well, it's not as simple as that. My New Year's resolution was to lose 1% of my body weight per week, and I did it the first week. It wasn't too hard, but I think I'd have a challenge continuing that for a whole full 52 weeks. After the low-hanging fruit is taken, it becomes harder and harder to reduce use. So it certainly can be done. It's just, it certainly will prove challenging. One of the things that we're doing at Metropolitan to try to reduce that challenge is we have an innovative conservation program where we solicit ideas from people on how they think conservation programs could be developed. We have a review panel that looks at the proposals that come in. The most promising ones, then we do a test study to evaluate the conservation benefits from those proposals, and then finally come out with a report. And if they're promising, we move forward and implement them. So there are ways to try to see if maybe there are some lower hanging fruit than others. But as time goes by, those get used up, and it does become more and more challenging to achieve the same results as you had in the past. Next slide. And my final slide is I think the three important areas, at least from my perspective in the Basin study. One is that it provides a framework for the states to work together to meet future needs. In the past, the states have worked together on things like coordinated operations of the reservoirs, but when it came for a state to reduce its water use, each state was on its own. California developed the 4.4 plan. Nevada's developing its in-state resource plan to northern Nevada. Arizona's developing a plan to deal with shortages. But I think this Basin study provides a roadmap for us all to develop perhaps a Basin 13.9 plan, or whatever the future runoff is, to work together. Second is, I think that the study offers options to sit back and consider alternative futures that we might face. Do we want to emphasize, or how much do we want to emphasize, conservation, local supply development, ag to urban transfers, and perhaps some large augmentation like seawater desalination plant in Mexico? Metropolitan has been emphasizing those first two, conservation, local supply development, and ag to urban transfers. But maybe there is enough interest to protect agriculture in the future so that we don't want to have that much reduction in ag that we might consider something that otherwise might not seem to make sense. So it lets policymakers choose the future that they want to see, or at least have that discussion. And then the last thing in the Basin study that's fairly unique is that over the last decade, many of us have heard Nevada say, or people in Nevada say, why don't you build a desalination plant in California and through exchange provide water to Nevada? It was talked about but never analyzed. For the first time, this study does analyze what if we implement water use efficiency or local supply projects in one area to provide benefits throughout the basin. Could a water recycling plant be funded in Southern California for the benefit of Phoenix? I mean, that was never, this gives us a fresh look to see if things like that can happen. So with that, I look forward to working with with the states and the agencies to explore how we might implement some of these options. That's all I have. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. That gives a lot of food for thought also. Perhaps I'm optimistic here, but I think I hear everyone saying that we all agree that water efficiency is part of the solution. We may disagree how much more is available, how pricey it'll be, but I believe I'm hearing all the speakers say that this has got to be a part of the solution. And the bigger question is how do we do it together? What's next? Can we share across state and basin lines? Can we help each other? The audience has been really disciplined in their questions, and there are some technical ones, and then there are some really broader questions, such as the one I just posed. I'd like to take the technical questions first. I'd like to thank anyone who needs to leave early for your participation. We are recording this. It will be available on the WEEN CRB website in the next couple days. Anyone else wants to type in a comment or a question? If we run out of time and don't get to you, we'll try to get to everybody in the next 15 minutes. And if you liked this and want to do more, think about joining joining online, joining the Water Efficiency Action Network for the next couple webinars. So couple of more technical questions. We had a number of questions about weather modification savings, how they were calculated, what specifically is included, and we'd like to start with Carly on that.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. So when we refer to weather modification, we're primarily talking about cloud seeding, so cloud seeding in mountainous regions to increase snowfall. Activities like this have been in place for a long time in the basin. This has been explored. The sources we use to put together the costs and the potential yield from weather modification activities were derived from, there was a study on long-term augmentation options that the basin states put together. That study was used, the Metropolitan Water District put together a nice report that summarized many earlier studies leading up to 2005. So again, I want to refer you to our technical report F. This is all about the different options that were explored in the report. So this is going to have a nice section along with all of the references for how the values and cost and yield were put together. You know, I want to say one thing about weather modification and how it was handled in the study is that it's cheap and it has the potential to yield a significant amount of water. However, it's extremely unreliable and uncertain. And so while weather mod shows up in each one of the portfolios, it's not used as a reliable option that we think needs, that would take the place of other options kind of as we move forward to resolve future imbalances. And I think I'd ask Eric or Bill if there's anything you want to add to that.
Hey, this is Brad. Let me just add there's a 2003 National Research Council publication entitled Critical Issues in Weather Modification Research that is a good resource if anyone's interested in more details.
Thanks, Brad.
I have nothing else.
Okay, so the technical appendices, are they posted now on the study website, or will they be posted shortly?
No, everything is available on the study website.
Okay, we've had a couple of comments about weather modification, but I think they fit into looking at the technical appendix. A very specific question, what is dust on snow mitigation? Harley?
Brad, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I've been involved in some new studies on the impacts of dust on snow. And this work is led by Tom Painter at Jet Propulsion Lab and Jeff Deans here at the University of Colorado. And what the initial results suggest is that runoff is occurring on average about 3 weeks earlier because of this dark surface, which now absorbs more solar energy and melts sooner. And on average, we're losing about 5% of the flow relative to pre-European settlement of North America. This dust arises because of all kinds of activities in the deserts of the American Southwest, much of which is centered on some of the Native American reservations. And there is some theory, yet to be proven, that we can do things to keep this dust from getting mobile in the springtime when these storms come through, put it in the atmosphere, move it from the southwest to the northwest and deposit it in the headwaters of the Colorado River. To what extent we can really do this, we're not sure, but we think there are some savvy things we can do, and you're going to see and hear more about this in the coming months and years.
Okay, thanks. We're going to try to stay on the efficiency topics. There have been several comments and questions on other aspects that are related, like fallowing and groundwater reduction and so forth. So if we have time for those, we'll get to them. Specifically on agriculture, we have a comment, which may or may not be also a question. If 90% of ag water in western Colorado is for hay and alfalfa and cattle, and there's evidence to suggest that cattle do have some effect, however big or little, on climate change and on water quality, this question, I think, applies to not just the cattle industry. How can we focus on human and industrial behavior patterns to help with the water shortage, not just in the cattle industry, but also in other aspects? So the question has to do with, first, the indirect connections between human and industry practices and water shortages and what we can do about it. Eric, do you want to start?
Well, yeah, I can in part address that. You know, not all of that, hay, and pasture, and is part of the cattle industry. Okay, a big portion of it might be, but it's also, from a western Colorado perspective, it's open space. It's not development. Okay, so there's two sides to that coin. The point, and a lot of it is quite frankly lifestyle, small ranchettes and things like that, where people may have a couple of horses or so there is a lot of it, I think, in some of the valleys where it's used for cattle, but I'm not sure that what the question is getting at, but I do know that one of the points we're looking at is that if we're going to do this deficit irrigation on a cattle ranch, what we're probably looking at is paying that rancher to permanently reduce his herd, because their herd size is based on their pasture ground and how much hay and alfalfa they can produce. So those are the things that are on the table that are going to move forward, and it has become an interesting situation from our perspective, from our situation, where yes, it may help with the water, but it may cause in-stream flow problems in terms of late season return flows, and it's going to cause a lot of community angst about taking out some of these high mountain valley cattle ranches and replacing them with who knows what.
Okay, this is Cindy. There are two related comments on completely different aspects of water use. One comment in reference to what Bill said about how much low-hanging fruit may or may not be available is that it's primarily a social problem. This is on the municipal water efficiency side. And another comment that the lead on a lot of the media coverage for the Basin study had to do with the pipeline. How do we get the media message across about the values of water and the importance of water efficiency? How do we get response in that? So I'm going to open it up to everybody to respond to that briefly. How do we not just talk about one industry or one ranchette, but how do we get the message across more broadly? Who wants to go first?
You know, Cindy, this is Brad. That's a difficult question, but let me suggest that water is a 21st century problem independent of climate change. Climate change makes our water problems worse. It's hard to pick up a newspaper nowadays and not read something about water scarcity somewhere in the world, and more likely than not in your own region. So I think overall, time and awareness is on our side here. And I mean, there are all kinds of little things. You know, one thing that always gets into my craw is we just do a very poor job of letting people know how much water they really utilize in their homes. And once people begin to pay attention to that and begin to pay attention to what their neighbors use as well, you can do really significant things in a short period of time, as Drew said earlier. So we've already begun this transition, and I think, and the media has been helpful here, and we need to do more of the same. I mean, that's sort of a simple and perhaps not as interesting answer as I might give, but we are on our way.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else, or should I move on?
This is Drew. I'd like to make a comment on the low-hanging fruit being basically a social construct, and I tend to agree with that in many ways. I guess I would argue that I still think there's literally fruit on the ground, whether or not it's low-hanging, because there are many people that still have very old toilets, that still use high-flow shower heads, that don't have any idea about where their water comes from or how it's used. And so for those people, there is still low-hanging fruit certainly available. But fundamentally, you know, in the West, about half of our water use goes outdoors. And so if you talk about what's actually required for humans from a health and sanitation perspective, we could easily cut, well, perhaps easily is not the right word, but you could cut water use by 50% from today's rates and not have any impact on personal health and sanitation in the home. There may be other impacts to your outdoor recreation opportunities in your backyard, but those are things that I agree are more social in nature than technological. And those are sort of the reason behind my comment that what we need in the water efficiency field are more psychologists and social scientists and less engineers.
So one question would be, how do we move from the basin-wide numbers down to the more local situations, find those places, both agricultural and municipal, where there is more that can be done easily, as well as tackling the bigger, the more challenging, more expensive options along the lines of what Bill was talking about. We had a question earlier for Carly. Do any of the demand studies address the differences in comparing the upper and lower basin areas in terms of assumptions?
Yeah, absolutely. The way the demand scenarios were developed, they were developed with the 7 basin states and included input from other stakeholders. And each state submitted numbers for each one of the 6 different demand scenarios for various planning areas throughout the states. So those were very much a product of what is going on and what is projected by those state agencies within a respective state. There was not a one-size-fits-all type approach that was applied to develop the future demand scenarios.
Okay. We had a couple of questions earlier related to the bigger picture. One is it safe to, these are comments. One is it safe to say that higher mean temperatures due to climate change will mean increased demand. Another is how does the 85% water availability that appears to be likely, how does that square with statements that the Colorado River is over-allocated? I don't know that we need to discuss them unless somebody really wants to say something.
Cindy, maybe I can take that second comment, and I think maybe Brad might be the appropriate person to talk to the first one. I think with the second one, it's really getting to what is well known and established on the Colorado River Basin is that demand exceeds supply, and our long-term average of 15 million acre feet, which is just the 100-year historical record, the allocations on the river exceed that amount. And we've been getting by up till this point due to the fact that the upper basin has not grown in to their full allocation, and also because of the massive amount of reservoir storage that we have on the system. We have the ability to store about 4 times what the average annual flow is. And the study, the point of the study was to do kind of just what the comment I think was getting to, is to look 50 years into the future at some plausible ranges for how that demand and that supply may evolve. And we're seeing supply is on average trending downwards and demand is on average trending upwards. And I think that's really why we're all here today.
Okay.
And I would just say, you know, increasing temperatures in the absence of changes in precip very clearly increase water demand. Where it gets complicated in the Colorado is the fact that we might see some increases in precip in some months. For example, it looks like the winters might get slightly wetter and our springs and summers drier, and that will affect the demand pattern that we currently have.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. One is, well, 3 more questions. Oh Lord, all of a sudden everybody's sending questions. That's great. So one is, and then I would like to say a couple things before everybody signs off about where to get copies of this. So the first question is a yes or no. Yes or no, the 5% loss due to dust on snow is part of the water budget as presented in the Basin study. Carly, yes or no?
Yes.
And C, and I'm going to answer it for you, and C, technical appendix F for details.
Yes.
Yeah.
Watershed, it's the watershed management appendix. It's appendix 8. Okay. We've had a couple of comments about the balance between social and engineering solutions. One person says we've chosen lawn as opposed to over food. Another person suggests that engineering as well as social solutions can be useful, and by implication, engineering can be applied to some of these water efficiency measures. One question I would really like to, one comment I would like to get to and one question I'd like to get to, and then we need to wrap up. The panelists, I think, can stay on for a few more minutes for those who are interested. So a comment, 50% is on the ground for evaporation as well. This describes a task group at, concerning a canal in San Diego and the importance of water, more efficient outdoor water use in solving that problem. A municipal question I'd like to have everyone's response to is related to water rate structures that favor water sales, balancing
accelerating conservation with water rates versus ensuring financial integrity for water agencies. Thoughts on that? Maybe starting with Bill?
Yeah, well, we certainly use water rates. We have a tiered rate structure to encourage water conservation at Metropolitan, and then some of our member agencies have further tiered rates. So tiered pricing is, of course, a way to reduce use. It does come with the any conservation. I mean, we fund conservation projects. We essentially pay people to stop buying water from us. That presents financial challenges. We have had to raise rates significantly to cover that. So it's not just, as Drew said, there are infrastructure costs, but also a choice to pay for conservation to reduce use. And rates are going up, and that's part of the education process that people have to understand that they are going to get a lot more expensive, and that is going to help keep. I mean, some of the when we show the chart with an economic downturn has reduced use throughout the West. Some of that is because of the price increase, and so some of that demand will never rebound. And will continue to save as the price goes up.
Okay, anyone else?
This is Drew. I don't have any crystal ball awesome answers for how to deal with this challenge between rate structures that both incentivize conservation and Bill said having to raise rates to deal with the fact that you lost money. But just know that there are a lot of bright people thinking about this particular issue, and it very well may be that the water rate structures 10 years from now may look nothing like the ones we have today. You may have something that looks much more like your cell phone plan, where you have a set quantity of water that you buy from your provider, and if you go over that, you face big penalty charges, and if you go under it, maybe you can roll it over to next month's use or something like that. But that conservation revenue stability issue is a very hot topic right now with a lot of people, and I expect to see some very interesting things coming out of this in the next couple of years.
Oh, great. We'll close the official portion of the next slide, please. We'll the official portion right now by saying, by reading one last comment, perhaps from one of you. Perhaps it's time to reread Overtapped Oasis by Mark Reisner and Sarah Bates. And this person quotes former Secretary of the Interior Babbitt. By putting economics back into the water equation, there's still plenty of water available for those users willing to pay the real price. I would like to also repeat that I look forward to next steps on how to move ahead on water efficiency basin-wide, identifying how we work together and identifying places we can work together to achieve savings. Their options are selected. One question was how can people get copies of the slides? And the presentation will be posted in the next couple of days online at the WEEN CRB website. Look for the broadcast there. Look for more information about the organization. Thank you to the panelists